Okay.
And
It should be good, right? Just move. Just get rid of Fred. Get rid of Fred. Poor Fred. All right.
is that called a contract?
All right, we probably should get started. I'm Ed Fitzgerald, the Vice President of the Emeritus Center. I'm here instead of our President, Jim Van Forest, who I think is still in Florida, but coming back soon. Anyway, yes, this is, I think we're past the halfway point.
We're at the halfway.
Are we about the halfway point in our programs for the spring semester? And we have with us, Scott Burge, I think most of you know him. He's our program chair for this year. And today's speaker, Professor Gary Kleppel. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Scott. We'll do the formal introductions for Gary, and then Gary will take it from there. All set?
I gotta have a confession. I usually ask our speaker to give me something of their bio so I don't ramble on and tell bad stuff. And twice now this semester, when that lady out there opened up our session and when this gentleman here gave me their bios, I read and I read and I read, and there wasn't a bad thing in it. And I figured pages 2 and 3 of all of your achievements. I boiled it down to one. Dr. Gary Kleppel, biology professor emeritus, has been continuing his research in agricultural ecology, funded by a 3 Voices grant from the Emeritus Center, a William Reese Fellowship, and a grant from the New York State Soil Health Program. Gary is also active in his community, chairing the Agricultural Advisory Committee for the town of Knox, and vice chairing the Albany County Agriculture and Farmland Protection Board. We're protected.
Okay.
As best. As the chair of Knox's Agricultural Advisory Committee, Dr. Kleppel is leading an effort to create a farmland protection plan for the town. In conversations with officials at the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, Gary learned of the department's concern about unregulated suburban development in the region and its potentiality with negative impacts to agriculture and ecosystems in Knox. Once complete, the Farmland Protection Plan will provide information and policy recommendations to help the town's elected officials create legislation that will protect the rural character and agricultural livelihoods that have been important to this region for over 2 centuries. This past fall, Gary presented lectures on regenerative agriculture and its positive impacts on human and environmental health to UAlbany students in the first-year experience program and to upperclassmen in an applied ecology course. He will also be speaking to a graduate class in agroecology and at the Emeritus Center this winter, which is now. So we're in the spring, actually, and we have Gary. So let's listen to him.
Well, thank you very much. I crossed the first hurdle. I didn't trip over that wire. I think we're on our way. I just want to start, usually I put the acknowledgements to my talks at the end, but today I'm putting it up front before you fall asleep, because I want you to know that the Emeritus Center here at UAlbany has played a really significant role in the work that I'm about to describe. Whether you're full-time or retired, researchers need funding. For me, much of that funding has come from the Emeritus Center through the 3 Voices grant and the William Reese Fellowship, as well as from, as Scott said, the New York Soil Health Program. And I'll be showing you data that I collected from both sources. I also need to acknowledge my colleagues, Fred Provenza, who I disappeared a minute ago. Fred is emeritus professor at Utah State. He and I co-authored the first version of the paper of the talk I'm going to give today for the 2024 conference of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. Caroline Girard was my last graduate student, and Peter Groffman from the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in the City University of New York also collaborated on some of what you'll see. And Peter, Carolyn, and I are collaborating on a paper that will be, some of which I'll be discussing today. So, and I might add that Peter Groffman was just elected president of the Ecological Society of America. So I feel like I'm in really good company here. So if you've been alive for the past decade or so, you can't have missed the point that there's an energetic debate going on between plant-based and meat-based food systems, or at least omnivorous food systems. I'm going to change course a little bit today and suggest that the debate should not be about plant-based versus omnivorous food systems, but about food systems that sustain human and environmental health and those that do not. So let's let me sort of shortcut through the great plant-based versus meat-based debate. One camp says meat production and consumption are environmentally unhealthy and clinically unhealthy and morally obscene. Meat production requires enormous amounts of land and water. Livestock overgraze, trample landscapes, and basically destroy ecosystems. Animal agriculture is a major source of pollutants, including greenhouse gases, the largest of which is the largest anthropogenic source of which is methane. The ethics of slaughtering animals for food are questionable, especially since alternatives exist. And consumption of red and processed meats is linked to a variety of morbidities. The other camp argues that meat production and consumption are totally natural and healthy for humans and for the environment. They point out that crop production also requires large amounts of water, and well-managed pasture actually improves the health of the soil. They argue that cultivation of crops and grains are also huge non-point pollutant sources, and that crop agriculture emits as much or more greenhouse gases as animal agriculture, and it sequesters less carbon to the soil than pasture. And removing meat from our diets would require more land than does animal agriculture, and only 1/3 of the arable land on the planet can be used to produce crops at large scale. The rest can only be used to produce animals. Consumption of red meat, if separated from the processed meat data, does not show an association with morbidity, according to Jane Buxton. And Stefan van Vliet, at the time from Duke University, suggested that 53% of those adopting plant-based diets quit within a year. So an interesting debate. But I'm going to suggest something else. I'm going to suggest the majority of meat and crop production done in this country and in the developed world, and increasingly the developing world, are damaging ourselves and our planet. The ultimate non sequitur is that food is a key part of our life support system, but to produce it, we have to destroy our life support system. Okay. So let me show you what we're doing to our life support system, including ourselves. Okay. About 40 to 50% of the soils globally have been degraded by tillage, that's plowing, and by synthetic inputs, that's synthetic fertilizers and herbicides and other pesticides, and by overgrazing and the activities of animals. Agriculture is one of the most important non-point sources of pollutants to U.S. surface waters. The poster child for that is that the watershed of the Mississippi River takes on so much nutrients and dumps all that nutrient, so much of that nutrient material into the Gulf of Mexico, and I still think it's the Gulf of Mexico, that it has created a hypoxic zone, an area of very low oxygen, the size of the state of Rhode Island. Globally, agriculture accounts for 80 to 90% of surface water withdrawals on the planet, mostly for irrigation. Agriculture contributes significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, and animal agriculture, as I said, is the largest source of human-caused methane emissions. Rice is second. And every year, 4.3 million metric tons of pesticides are used on the earth on this planet. Leading Gabe Brown, sort of an iconic farmer in North Dakota, to comment that the current production model is all about killing. We have an agriculture of death. Serious impacts have been recorded on birds, mammals, and pollinators, and glyphosate. Glyphosate is the principal ingredient, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, the world's most widely used pesticide. Glyphosate is in 90% of our food crops, and it's linked to numerous morbidities. And I want to show you some of this. This is from a paper by Swanson. Forgive the quality of the graphics, but if we look at this data on thyroid cancer, notice the yellow bars. That's the incidence of thyroid cancer from 1975 to about 2020. The red line is the application of glyphosate since 1990, when it was introduced to the market. And obviously, you don't have to be a mathematician to see that these two features track each other quite well. Same with the incidence of diabetes, same with the incidence of inflammatory bowel syndrome, same with 21 different morbidities that Swanson et al. Have examined. Now, what they're showing in this table is something called the Pearson-R correlation coefficient. It's the relationship or association or correlation between each of these morbidities and the application of glyphosate, the amount of glyphosate applied. And you can see these numbers, which generally range from -1 to +1, are very close to 1. That means there's a perfect correlation. If I see a perfect correlation, I know people have taken too little data or they're cheating. So these are about as close as you can come to a perfect correlation. And the other thing about correlations is a correlation does not imply causation. I can't say that application of glyphosate causes thyroid cancer, okay? But what I can say is, damn, there are 21 diseases here, and they're all strongly correlated with glyphosate application. Shouldn't we take a very careful look and be very concerned? And that's the most I can say. But that in itself, and by the way, courts are now giving rewards to people or awarding people damages for exposure to glyphosate. So I hope that in the last few slides, I've sort of convinced you that we are in the middle of one of the great non sequiturs in the history of the human species, okay? And so you say, well, what can we do? And what can we do, I think, is really summed up by a simple rancher named Dan Chapman. He says, if you want to make small changes, you need to do things differently. But if you want to make big changes, you need to see things differently. And this man saw things differently. His name was Robert Rodale. His dad, Jerome Rodale, was a publisher, very wealthy in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in New York City. But he was also a pretty sickly guy, had a lot of digestive problems. And so he started reading the literature about an emerging alternative agriculture being practiced by people like Lady Balfour and Sir Albert Howard. And these people, the techniques that emerge from their work are now called organic agriculture. And so Jerome Rodale bought a small farm in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania and started growing food regeneratively, and his stomach, his digestive problems started going away. Robert was his son, and Robert took that little farm and turned it into one of the world's leading agricultural research institutions. And we're going to hear a little more about what they've done over time. I apologize for the squiggly lines. These guys obviously have been drinking. But this concept of regenerative agriculture was coined by Robert Rodale. And simply stated, regenerative agriculture is ecologically based farming, following principles of that we can learn from studying ecosystems and how wild and natural ecosystems function. In the past 2 years, I've reviewed 4 papers. Academics are becoming interested in this concept of regenerative agriculture. It's been being practiced by farmers for a long time. In fact, one farmer said, we can't even talk about sustainable agriculture until we regenerate the soil. Remember, 40 to 50% of our soils are degraded. Okay, so there's no, at this point, clear single definition of what you do to be a regenerative farmer, but there are certain trends. One is, don't break the soil surface. Don't till or plow the soil. Manage the soil as the thin layer of the earth that stands between us and starvation. Respect it. Keep it covered as much as possible. When you're dealing with animals, pay attention to the way animals behave, aggregate, and move in nature, rather than deciding how we should be raising animals. And how do we do that? Well, one thing that we know about, especially the large ungulates, the zebras and wildebeests and bison, they all tend to aggregate relatively closely compared to the way we conventionally aggregate our animals at about 1 ton per acre. You'll have 700,000 pounds of wildebeest on the Serengeti plain at a single time. Move them constantly. So instead of keeping them on a pasture continuously, get them off the pasture to a new pasture, and let the grazed pasture rest for 30, 60, 160, 120 days. Okay, and that brings us the magic. And I can't say that we understand all of this, and I can't say that it works 100% of the time, but that is the foundation of regenerative agriculture. Let me just quickly go through a comparison of conventional versus regenerative farming. So all farming is based on producing things, but how we produce it is very different in conventional and regenerative processes. In conventional agriculture, we want to get as much yield as we can, as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible, and get it off the farm as quickly as possible. Regenerative agriculture doesn't rush. We still have to produce, but we also pay at least as much attention to the environment and and to the quality of the resources that we're using. Conventional agriculture specializes and focuses on monocultures.
Corn.
Right. I didn't get that.
Corn.
Oh, corn, yeah. Or cattle. What do? I raise dairy cattle. I have 9,200 head of cattle. My large animal vet's brother is a vet in Wisconsin. He has one customer. It's a dairy farm with 9,200 head of cattle that never sees the light of day. They're always in the barn. Okay. But to do this, you generally have to work at large scale. When you have 9,200 head of cattle in a barn, you have to grow enormous amounts of corn to feed that livestock. Regenerative farmers tend to be more diversified. We stack enterprises, it's called, and we work generally at smaller to medium scales. Conventional agriculture almost always uses heavy tillage, heavy plowing, and intensive use of these synthetic inputs. Regenerative farmers tend to reduce or eliminate tillage. They can, there are actual seed drills that allow you to seed without tilling the soil, without turning it over in a major way. And we try to do our best to move away from synthetic inputs. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Apple growers almost always need to use some kind of pesticide sooner or later. But there are two apple growers in Albany County. One sprays it continuously through the year, and the other waits for a reason to spray, that an insect has attacked his crop, and then he gets rid of them. But the reduction in the use of synthetic inputs is really important. In raising livestock, conventional agriculture wants to get those animals grown as fast as possible, as quickly, and off the farm as quickly as possible. So you use high energy diets composed of grains, and sometimes you add antibiotics, which stimulate the energy production biochemical pathway in the system, the Krebs cycle. Sometimes when you send your animals to a feedlot, they receive an implant that contains estradiol or other hormones to help fast grow them. In regenerative agriculture, most of the work is pasture-based, and never do we use growth stimulants. Animals, and this is obscene to me, some animals, dairy cattle, chickens, pigs, never see the light of day. They spend the time, from the time they're born to the time they die or are processed, in a barn. To me, that's obscene, and regenerative agriculture abhors that behavior. That's not human. So let's talk about how all this translates to our food supply. So the first thing, of course, that you want to know about your food is it going to kill me, right? Is it safe? So in 2023, the USDA and Food and Drug Administration issued 312 recalls amounting to 1,800 metric tons of crops and meat, mostly from large farms that were contracted to corporations. Okay. This is some old data, but I think very relevant. Pay attention to the black bars. This represents the amount of E. coli 0157H7 in the meat from beef cattle. And by the way, this research was done at Cornell. And what this shows is, as you increase the amount of grain in the diet from a diet completely on pasture to an animal that's fed 80% grain, the E. coli 0157H7, by the way, that bug will kill you in 12 days. It destroys the kidneys. The E. coli increases exponentially. This is a logarithmic scale. This is increasing E. coli. So grain-fed animals, typical of a conventional system, which is most of our food, that's what the risk is. And usually people get sick before USDA in this case would pick that up. Okay. This is a pig barn. And this and in hospitals where antibiotics were used irresponsibly, is where antibiotic resistance, like methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, evolved. What happens when you have animals packed so tightly, thousands of animals in a barn packed so tightly that they cannot even turn around, somebody's going to get sick. And when one gets sick, they're so close, everybody gets sick. And so what the farmer does is he delivers a dose of antibiotics to the whole herd. And of course, there are a few microbes in that in that herd that are resistant to the antibiotic. So now they spread through the herd. And now another antibiotic is used, and another, until you run out of antibiotics. And now you have an antibiotic resistant microbe. Okay. Antibiotic resistance has never been documented in pasture-raised pigs or, to my knowledge, any other livestock. Just not there. And think about bird flu, by the way. Same deal. The second thing you want to know about your food, of course, is, am I getting nourished? Is it nutritious? And to cut to the chase, our food is becoming less nutritious. From 1950 to 1999, we've seen a huge decrease, or significant, I should say, decrease in the amount of major nutrients in the crops that we grow. And the reason for that, as Bartward says, the causes of the decline in nutritional quality of foods include synthetic nutrient application, the use of high-yielding varieties that grow fast but don't absorb a great deal of nutrients, and a shift from natural farming to chemical farming. So here's a comparison between regeneratively produced beef, grass-fed and grass-finished, and conventionally produced beef, grain-fed and grain-finished. And to, again, cut to the chase, the concentrations of beta-carotene, which is an antioxidant itself and also the precursor to vitamin A and other carotenoids, and as well as vitamin A and alpha tocopherol, which is vitamin E. The regenerative meat contains 2 to 10 times more of these carotenes and vitamins. They also have the grass-fed finished meat also contains less total lipid, about a quarter, and a better ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-6 fatty acids are the bad cholesterols, and omega-3 are the good cholesterols. And I use these air quotes because you need both, but you need them in a certain ratio. The 1-to-1 is perfect, and that's what is typical of grass-fed meat. Grain-fed meat tends to have omega-3, 6 to omega-3 ratios of around 4 or higher. I've seen it as high as 25. Okay, so, and that's where you start getting CVD, cardiovascular issues and other things like that. And the same thing is true with eggs. Eggs collected from pastured chickens and brought to a lab and analyzed showed that their carotene and vitamins, as well as their lipid profiles, were far superior to what the USDA defines as the standard nutrition for an American egg. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that USDA did that.
Used to do that.
Used to. Yeah, I think that's probably true. And of course, the industry, big food, will tell you that, well, it's all nice, well and good, but organic farming cannot produce enough food to feed us all. Okay, and even the media will tell you that. I heard Tamar Haspel from the Washington Post just a couple of weeks ago say that organic farming is a niche product. Okay, and that's a good opinion, but scientists don't traffic in opinions. We traffic in data, and the Rodale Institute has data. They've been collecting data on the capacity to produce organic food for 40 plus years. They raise the same crops side by side. And Pam and I have visited this place. It's pretty amazing. And they've been doing this for more than 40 years. And so here's just one little bit of information. on a recently published paper on corn yield. Corn is an extremely important product in the American diet and food system. And they raise the corn conventionally with full or reduced tillage. And then they raise side by side corn with what they call green manure, legumes, clover and peas ground into the soil as a manure, as a fertilizer, and then with animal manure. And clearly, the animal manure and conventional fertilizers yielded statistically the same amount of corn. Now, what happened is that in 2016, remember, this has been going on for 40 years. In 2016, there was a drought. And look at how the conventional corn performed relative to the organic products. The organic products performed much better. And Pam and I had the opportunity to sit down and talk with Jeff Moyers, who is you'll love the CEO Emeritus of the Rodale Institute. And he told us that it's very typical for conventional crops to show years of boom and years of bust. They don't do very well under meteorological extremes, whereas organically produced crops tend to be very resilient and stable in their production. And I think that kind of answers the question for me. Yes, organic agriculture can produce as much food as conventional ag, but with less variability due to meteorological extremes. You might have heard we're in a period of meteorological extremes these days. Let me talk a little bit about the environment. I'm going to focus on three areas. We could talk for days about the environment, but I'm going to talk about biodiversity, soil health, and carbon, particularly as it relates to climate change. So biodiversity, this is some data from my former graduate student, Caroline Girard-Cartier. It appeared in her dissertation, which, by the way, was a dissertation of distinction. Very proud of her. What she was doing was she was comparing the biodiversity, the number of plant species, and she's a really good taxonomist, the numbers of plant species that emerged from grasslands that hadn't been grazed in at least 10 years, and in which she set up paddocks where the sheep that she put on these paddocks was managed regeneratively, that's RM, or conventionally or ungrazed. And I see that somehow this little ungrazed got displaced. But and she looked at two different farms. One was a wet bottomland, and the other was a drier upland. And in both cases, her data suggested that the number of species of plants that emerged at the end over the season was higher in the regeneratively managed pasture than either the conventional or, get this, the ungrazed pasture or grassland. Okay, so I think one day she said, "Geez, we did better than God," but told her to watch what she says. But again, high regenerative, high stock density, short duration of grazing, and long rest. Then as soon as the animals have grazed, they go to a new pasture. They're not starved or anything, go to a new pasture. And that pasture doesn't see sheep again for 30, 60, or 120 days or so. Yes.
Yeah, I suppose the ungrazed is, I mean, it's the same as leaving the land fallow, which is one way of getting it to regenerate. But I suppose the regenerative, they have the advantage of the manure going on.
Exactly. Exactly. And we'll get to this in a minute, but it's not just the manure, but it's what the manure is doing to the microbes, then what the microbes are doing to the plants. They are making the plants happy. They're setting up an economy. they're trading sugar from the plants for nutrients from the microbes. And this economy it has well, the Earth has been a food producing ecosystem for 4.5 billion years. And this has been going on for at least 500 million years. So, yeah, as Caroline said, God got it right.
One of the questions I've got is touring the US, seeing, the middle of the country where you've got tremendous agriculture. I think it's someplace like North Dakota, Montana. I think it's Montana where it takes, 33 acres to raise one cow and one calf.
Mm-hmm. Yep, we were on a ranch there.
Yeah,
That's because they're,
RM
I don't want to be glib and I don't have the time to really explain it in detail, but you can thank Cooperative Extension for that. Okay. Because that's what they think. Okay. There have been people who have taken near desert, okay, and run animals through that landscape the way they run through the Serengeti, and turned it into productive landscape. Okay. And this, again, I'm sorry for this. I don't think I can fix it, but what you're looking at here is a bunch of invasive species, plant species, purple loosestrife, Milamina common reed, multiflora rose. They're all widely recognized invasive plant species. In all of these sites, these species, there was no grazing going on. And we were hired in various places to put sheep on these sites and manage them regeneratively. And the T represents the amount of time that we're on the site. So the maximum amount of time was about 2.5 months. Okay. And this is what happened to the number of species, that they increased by something between 11.2 and 90%. We actually checked this one twice because we couldn't believe that after 45 days, we could see a 90% increase in the number of plant species on a site. But that's what we got twice. And what I did, scientists like to fit models to their data, never fit data to a model, but we like to fit models to our data. And there's a general model called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And it says when there's, ecosystems kind of need to be disturbed, but when there's very little disturbance, a few species, let's say a few plants like those invasives, will become really dominant. Okay. And when there's basically big disturbances, a volcano just wipes everything out, you'll get very few species, right? But at the intermediate level, wherever that might be, there is a point where you get the most species richness for any environment that any environment can carry. And I think that regenerative management gives us that intermediate disturbance. I think conventional agriculture tends to result by continuous grazing in the reduction of species richness. And when there's a lack of grazing, it leaves the ecosystem open to invasion and ultimately the reduction, the domination by a few species. So that's sort of something that I published in 2011 and with my students. And I think it still holds. It's a very simple model, but it still holds. The other thing that this is sort of a chance for you to look away from the math and the data a little bit and just listen to the way we think about wildlife. In conventional farms, the last thing you want is a bunch of birds eating your crops or a bunch of rabbits eating your crops. We've never had that problem with the animals that we invite into our farm. We have some 20 species of birds. I'm not an ornithologist. Pam just got got a program where Cornell University will identify the birds by their song. So I have a feeling we're going to find we have more birds, but we have more than 20 species of birds on our pastures, including 4 grassland breeding species, as well as turkey, vultures, hawks, falcons, owls, and 1 American bald eagle that comes back. I think we call him Fred. We have moles, voles, rats, rabbits, mice, white-tailed deer, coyotes. No, they're not our enemy. We take our sheep off the pasture and bring them back to the barn at night. It's really fun because I get to work with my sheepdog. And the coyotes can go crazy. I have a neighbor who hunts everything, and he goes out with a night vision scope, and he says, we've got coyotes running all over the place. Sun comes up, the coyotes know to go to sleep. We come out with the sheep. We've only been bothered by coyotes once, and that was pups coming out of the den. They're like, they're like college freshmen. They never read the book, and they've probably been drinking too much, and they're always hungry. So, yeah, so they don't bother us. We have weasels, foxes. We have 1 fisher, which we don't like too much, but he's there, or she. And we have raccoons, skunks, possums. And when we came to Longfield Farm, I counted 5 species of plants on our pastures. Today we have 51. So in 20 years, we've increased our biodiversity by an order of magnitude. Now I want to talk a little bit about soil health. As I said before, soil is that thin layer of the earth that stands between us and starvation. I didn't make that up, but I think it's a really good thing. I don't know who said it, but soil health is the structural competency and functioning or functionality of the soil ecosystem, which gives way or results in positive outcomes for associated plant, animal, and human communities. So it's a good thing. And what I'm going to talk about today is this project that Caroline Gerard Cartier and Peter Groffman and I are working on, and it has to do with the soils in regeneratively and conventionally managed pastures in 2 parts of Albany and Schoharie counties. In the east, we have the Helderberg Escarpment, which is characterized by shallow, wet soils, poorly drained soils, not the best for growing much of anything, but grass grows there, and so sheep and cattle grow there well too. In Schoharie County, we find poor to excellent soils, a whole range of soils. And again, we're looking at conventionally and regeneratively managed pastures in these 2 places. And we're looking at the soil microbiome, the microbes that live in the soil. And these are incredibly important. As I mentioned just a little while ago, microbes are the things that cycle nutrients, that hold water, that lock carbon in the soil. They are totally associated with fertility. And so we're looking at 4 indicators of microbial indicators of soil health. First, MB, microbial biomass, the total amount of microbes. Second, soil organic matter, the organic carbon that is locked in the soil. FB is the fungal to bacterial ratio. It's a ratio of the fungal to bacterial biomass that tells us a lot about nutrient cycling and water conservation in the soil. And and the higher that ratio, the better the situation is, the more healthy that soil is going to be. And finally, H, the functional group diversity, biodiversity of the microbial community. Come on. So more data, sorry. These are the amounts or levels of each of these soil health indicators in regenerative and conventionally managed pastures in the east pastures and in the west pastures. And as you can see, the red crosses means that the difference between conventional and regenerative is significant. As you can see, for every indicator, the regenerative pastures performed better. In the West pastures, microbial biomass and fungal to bacterial ratio performed better were higher in regenerative pastures, but there was no statistical difference. The difference was not significant for regenerative and conventional pastures when we look at soil organic matter and biodiversity. And the reason I've kind of figured this out, and I didn't present it, I won't present any data today, but the variability in the soils is responsible for the fact that the soil organic matter, at least, is not different in regenerative and conventional pastures. Yes.
Is there any relationship to pH as you're more?
Perfect question. There it is. There's, when you collect data on you might be interested in these soil health indicators, but you also collect a lot of other data. So we collected information about the structure of the soil, the moisture in the soil, the pH of the soil, the temperature of the soil. And we'll call these physical attributes. We also can compare the microbes to each other. So we have microbial variables. And we also talk to the farmers about how they were managing their pastures. So we know about their rest and rotations, how many times they were moving their animals, and how long they've been grazing, and how many animals they put on the pastures. And so what you want to do is find a way to compare all these variables together. And there's a technique, of course, called principal components analysis, or PCA. And what you're getting is a map of what we call coherences, or just associations. So microbial biomass is positively associated with the structure of the soil. That's kind of what it means. And with the soil moisture. And we can talk about this map for a day. I mean, I could do a whole seminar. I probably will at some point, not here. But let's look at H, biodiversity. We see that biodiversity, the orange bars, by the way, that means that there's an association. Okay, so H, biodiversity, is associated with nothing that we measured. So there are a couple of possibilities. One is we didn't measure the things that biodiversity was associated with, and more likely, unfortunately, is the method that we used to measure biodiversity wasn't sensitive enough to pick up the correlation, the relationship. The other thing that's, I think, more important, it's going to be the punchline to our paper, is that if you look, things that farmers are doing in regenerative management have, and this is all positive, have positive impacts or influences on the microbiome and ultimately soil health. Nothing that the farmer is doing that we measured in a conventional practice has anything to do with soil health in the microbiome. So I think that's an important finding. Second, or to change course just slightly, I want to talk about carbon, and particularly climate change. And this is from a paper that I published in 2020. And what we're looking at is beef cattle and the greenhouse gases they produce from the day they're born to the day they leave the farm for the processing facility. It's called farm to gate. Okay. And Alan Rotz and his colleagues at the US Department of Agriculture produced an extremely elegant model of the greenhouse gas emissions from cattle, farm to gate, beef cattle. And beef cattle produce, and I think I've got this number right, it's a US EPA data set, but beef cattle produce something close to 96% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the US, okay? That is from animal agriculture. So talking about beef cattle is pretty much like talking about animal agriculture as a whole. And what we see is the largest source of greenhouse gases is from feed production. It's not from the cows themselves, but it's from the production of feed that goes to feed the animals. So what I did is I converted, or I altered the model so that we could look at what happens if we do a regenerative approach to raising beef cattle. What happens to the greenhouse gases? And what we see is if we just cut out the grains from the model, we see a very large decrease in the amount of greenhouse gases emitted. And overall, we see that by switching to a regenerative model of farming, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from beef cattle by 35%, more than a third. Now, there are two parts to agriculture's impact on carbon. One is how much carbon we put into the atmosphere. The other is how much carbon we take out of the atmosphere. And this is data from Gabe Brown's farm, ranch in Bismarck, just outside of Bismarck, North Dakota. And he's looking at carbon as soil organic matter in over a period of about 20 years. He bought the farm, his ranch, I should say, it's 5,000 acres. He bought his ranch from his in-laws in 1993. They were growing soy and corn conventionally. And you can see that the soil organic matter was pretty low. It was typical of their neighbors who have also ruined their soils. It was 1.7%. After 23 years in regenerative agriculture, the soil organic matter was 11.1%, and now it's even higher. I don't know the numbers, but essentially in 20 years, he increased the amount of carbon in the soil by over 500%. Thank you, Gabe. And the other part of that equation has to do with methane. Methane, of course, is a very potent greenhouse gas. Animal agriculture is the major source of anthropogenically produced methane, emitted methane. Rice production is the second most important. And there's one kind of organism, they're called methanotrophs. They're bacteria, they live in the soil, and essentially they eat methane. They absorb methane and use it to produce energy for themselves. Okay, methanotrophs, according to people who know a lot about methanotrophs, suggest that methanotrophy removes 33 million metric tons of methane from the atmosphere every year. It's the number one, it's essentially the only biological way of removing methane from the atmosphere. And what I did, I couldn't get a calibration, but I have a response curve from the gas chromatograph data that I collected, that I collected from my soils, and I was able to get a relative biomass, a relative amount of methanotrophs in regeneratively managed, conventionally managed pastures and hay fields. And obviously, there's about twice as much methanotrophic biomass in regeneratively managed soils, which is consistent with the other data that we collected on the microbes in this region. Yes.
Is it a non-technical term for methanotropes? What are they?
They're called protobacteria. They're very ancient bacteria, but when you get to that level of biology, there are no fancy names. It's all going to be Latin.
They chew methane and spit out carbon dioxide?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. They are aerobes. There are some that live nearly anaerobically, but they are primarily, as far as I know, I might be wrong on that. But you know, the thing that's hopeful is that Richard Teague and a number of other colleagues, including one colleague of his colleagues who is a distinguished professor of soil sciences at the Ohio State University. Teague was at Texas A&M. Together, they produced from modeling and empirical data, they produced a result that suggests that by converting U.S. agriculture, North American agriculture, to a regenerative model, we can make greenhouse gas emission, we can become greenhouse gas emissions negative, not neutral, negative. We absorbing more greenhouse gases than we're putting into the atmosphere. And so in summary, let me just say that the majority of the food produced in the developed and increasingly the developing world, both crops and meat, is good for neither humans nor the environment. Regenerative agriculture offers an alternative that focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, sequestering carbon, restoring soil health and biodiversity, eliminating toxic inputs, and producing safe, nutritious food. And hopefully I've shown you all of that. So the take-home message, the debate should not be about, at this point, should not be about whether plant-based or omnivorous food systems are better, but about food systems that sustain human environment and environmental health and those that do not. Thank you.
Two questions.
Oh, you only get one.
What's the difference in food costs, the bottom line?
Well, I'm going to answer it in two ways.
You only get one.
First way, it's usually more expensive. Okay. The second way, it depends what you mean by expensive. And there's a farmer in Swope, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, who is sort of an icon of sustainable agriculture. His name is Joel Salatin, and he does not mince words. And he says, if you think my food is expensive, try pricing out the cost of cancer. Okay, and that's a trade-off. When I give this talk to young people who are 20 years old and they have no money, I have to be careful how I answer that question. But people our age, I can say the decisions we're making about our food are actually decisions we're making about our health, and so and our grandchildren's health.
Thank you.
Sandy.
I think you could add to that 40% of the food that leaves the American stores is wasted.
Yeah.
And if you buy good food and don't waste it, you've solved that economic problem.
I think that's true. And when you buy nutrient-dense food, you don't eat as much. You tend to be satiated because your body tells you you've got the nutrients you need. Yes.
How does regenerative agriculture deal with like insects and plant diseases? And how successful is that compared to traditional methods like pesticides?
Right. So I would tell you that we've never put any kind of pesticide on our crops. I'm pretty sure Sandy Gordon, who's a better farmer than I'll ever be, doesn't use a lot of pesticides. And Gabe Brown said it best in a TED Talk. Or at this point, you probably know Gabe Brown a little bit. I met Gabe for the first time in an elevator in Louisville, Kentucky, at what's called an Acres meeting. He was drunk as a skunk, but he's a brilliant guy. And he says that, now I lost my train of thought, I'm so busy making jokes. Tell me your question again.
It was about what alternatives do you use instead of pesticides?
Oh,
And how
right.
successful
He says
are they?
he actually had an entomologist come to his farm, and he raises animals and crops, and he integrates the two. So he grows crops here for a year, and then he'll bring the animals in, and they'll eat the leftovers from the crops, leave a lot of fertilizer in return, and then move on. And this entomologist said that, for every insect pest, there are 1,500, I don't know if that's a real number, but 1,500 things that will eat that insect. Okay, so all you have to do is know enough ecology, and that's what we're doing is biological farming. Just know enough ecology to know who eats that insect and how to get them there. One thing that I'm reading a great book called The Light Eaters. Now, it depends how you say that. The Light Eaters is about plants. They eat light. The Light Eaters is about dieters. But in the Light Eaters, they talk about the communications that plants actually have, and they can actually signal to other plants to produce chemicals, working with the bacteria, by the way. They can produce chemicals, some de novo, meaning doesn't exist, and then it exists, to actually drive off the pests. So we have never put, even in our gardens, we have never used chemicals to suppress potential pests. And we find that we don't need them. The same is true at higher levels in the fields, where just by knowing the feeding and hunting cycle of a coyote, we can suppress the rat population, so we don't have rats in our barns. Okay, just by knowing the simple ecology of the organisms that are part of our environment, we can reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides.
But you need a diverse, multicultural ecosystem to do that, right? Because it's a monoculture,
Yeah,
you need to go back.
Yeah. Nature will destroy that monoculture for you. Yes.
Had a coworker 10 to 15 years ago who lived in Iowa on a combine farm. And he came to work late one day because they were either spraying or fertilizing or something. And I said, at that time, don't you have, what plans do you have for alternatives to this spraying or to this fertilizing because of the runoff in your water quality? And he said, we don't discuss that here. We're never going to do that. Is
Right.
there any kind of plan to convince farmers that this is the way to go? How do you get people to accept this?
Okay, that's the hardest part, by the way, and it's a really good question. When I lecture to a class full of students, I'll always say, if each of you changes the way you eat and consume, because basically, first of all, if I as a farmer don't grow what I want, I grow what you want. You as the consumer are the most important component or element of agriculture. You tell us what you want, and we will produce it. Okay, so if you want good food, we'll produce that food for you. What consumers have to do, the role that consumers play in agriculture, and Wendell Berry used to always start his lectures by saying, how many people are involved in agriculture today? And everybody would look around to see if there was anybody. And then he'd say, how many people had breakfast? And he said, then you're all involved in agriculture. Okay, so consumers will play a huge part. The thing that you don't do, and Sandy will back me up on this, I actually had a slide on this because, but I didn't have time to keep it in. It says the 11th commandment, never tell a farmer how to farm. Okay. So I would never tell a farmer how to farm. But what I would do, and the thing that got Gabe Brown into regenerative agriculture, he started out with his 1.7% soil and started spreading fertilizer and chemicals and planting his corn and soy. And for 4 years, he had storms and hail. He said at one point, nobody else in the county had a hailstorm, and the hail knocked out his whole crop, and they were broke. So he didn't have money for this stuff. But what he did have was a good pair of eyes. And he saw that the year that he couldn't fertilize and put herbicides down, he started getting really nice growth. And that was what started him. So to some extent, if you talk to a bunch of farmers who are doing regenerative agriculture, it only happens when they've found that they're going broke. And I believe that, and yes, well-grown food is more expensive, but that's the cost of regenerative agriculture. We're keeping the animals on the farm longer, and in return, they're producing the data say they're producing a more nutritious product. Yes,
And not to be negative, but.
I'll be negative.
So-
We're New Yorkers, come on.
Yeah. So you know that there's 3 corporations that do eggs and 3 that do
Yep.
pork. Okay, so isn't there tremendous lobbying? And what successfully are you gonna have in that kind of environment?
That is the real problem. And the only thing that will happen, I remember when the idea of sustainable agriculture came out, I remember the PBS NewsHour was being funded by Monsanto. That was one of their sponsors. And there was a guy walking into a cornfield with his arm around his son. Okay. And the words came up, dedicated to sustainable agriculture. So yeah, we know that. I don't know what the answer
Spelled
is.
dead.
But yeah, let me just finish the answer. But it's crucially important that we do that. And Winston Churchill once said, Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And I think that, you know, at this point, we're starting to see both issues with disease and issues with the environment that need to be turned around. And so, you know, as I tell my students, if you tell 10 people and they tell 10 people and they tell 10 people, I think it's 6 degrees of separation for everybody in the world, 6 sets of 10 people. Maybe there's a chance. But, you know, it is negative. It is negative. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And those who do try will be healthier. So you can watch, you'll live forever watching the world fall apart around you. Yes.
Don't need to, or want to live forever, but two questions. One about the, is there a place in your papers where you could get the information on the particular, I forget what they were, but the particular kinds of additives or molecules that cause such disastrous heart health and cancer?
There is a really good book. I'll give you an assignment rather than
Okay.
tell you the answer.
Great.
It's written by, and it's one-sided, but I believe she made a good point. Her name is Buxton. What's her name? Jane Buxton, thank you. And Jane Buxton wrote a book called The Great Plant-Based Con. Okay. It has 72 pages of references. It couldn't fit in the book because the book is close to 500 pages long. It is incredibly well documented information. And I would suggest, I would tell you that I've argued my own doctor to a standstill relative to the use of statins and low density and what low density lipids are telling us.
And this is a much smaller thing. You said something about not tilling the soil.
Yes.
And in my little, our little community garden on Ridgefield Park, we don't have any animals except for, you know, cats.
Right.
Occasional dog and some rabbits. And last night it looked like a hedgehog. But we're not going to kill any of them.
Right.
Sometimes we want to when they cut.
All been there,
But the
yeah.
point I want to ask you about is not. We tend to fork the soil each year. We work in you know, compost, and but we fork it, and that breaks it up. Now, what you're saying is there's a way of farming where you don't
have
disturb the soil.
right.
Now, what magic has to happen? so
It's
we
called
don't-
it's called a no-till seed drill. But what I would say in your case, if you're dealing with a plot, I don't know what, how,
It's not that big.
right,
It's-
okay,
It might be not quite the size,
okay.
size of this
Right.
room, not counted.
As soon as you're finished forking it, take mulch and cover it with mulch. You're going to disturb the microbial community there, but probably not a lot. Not as much as if you're running two tons of tractors and equipment over
Okay.
that property. And so you
Let
break
me
it
get
up
that, but-
and then cover it with a mulch. That will keep the carbon and the water in there.
Mhm.
And it will disturb some of the structure of
Yeah.
the soil. But if you have a healthy microbial, and if you can get compost is not a bag of nutrients. Compost is like inoculating bacteria and fungi into your
Yeah.
soil. And if you can compost it,
Yeah.
even there, you can cultivate it in and
Yeah.
then cover it with mulch. You'll be fine.
Or at least better.
Better, yeah. And
Yeah.
in large scale farming, we use these things called no-till seed drills, which we can't use because our soil is too
Yeah.
rocky
Yeah.
and too clayey. So we do we just broadcast seed.
Yeah, at this time of year.
Yeah, right.
Right
Yeah.
now,
Yeah, Pam was
crossing-
really proud of me. I got right before the last snow melted. I
That's
got
perfect.
my frost seeding done. Yes.
Two comments.
Yeah.
First, Albany did in past years have a course, Anthropology 401. It was taught by the late James Westman on agribusiness in the Americas,
Mhm.
which is sort of a counterpoint to what you're presenting. And the second on plant signaling, I think Zonover Harris probably was right.
What-
If you read Doonesbury,
Oh,
Zonover Harris was right.
what did,
Talks to plants.
oh, he talks to
Yeah.
actually, hey, Richard, did you have another question? You had two questions. You only asked one.
How do we make it happen?
Oh, okay. Well, I just told you we don't. Sorry. Yeah, I wish I could give you a pat answer on that. But yeah, I think if you want a really good read, I'm reading a book now, as I mentioned, I think The Light Eaters, and you'll be astounded. It's changed my way of thinking about basically life on the planet. It's by Zoe Schlanger, who was a reporter, I think, for The Atlantic. And she ended up quitting her job and just researching this book all over the world with some of the best scientists. And I know we have a really great scientist here. And if I told you what I'm thinking about plants right now, that they're intelligent, and there's even there are two hypotheses about whether or not plants can see and how you have non-centralized intelligence. It blows your mind. And yet
You won't get an argument.
okay. I don't think I could win that argument. But I think she's got data from people from the University of Washington, Edinburgh University. There's a guy at Edinburgh University who's documented 20 senses in plants. We have 5. Okay, so yes, Sandy.
There was a great radio program on public radio by Dr. Vandana Shiva.
Oh, yeah.
And she, in her presentation, spoke of how it was organic that would be able to feed the world by virtue of the healthy microbial army versus conventional agriculture with no microbial army.
Yeah, I think there's I had one experience with what I think are microbes. I grew Helderberg hops on our farm, and just for personal beer making. But the first year I did this, I was totally wiped out by aphids. The second year, I mulched some compost into my soil, and at the same time, I was reading about how these de novo chemicals are produced by bacteria when the plant signals that it's in trouble. And I have never had another infestation of anything in my hops.
Yeah. And turkeys love aphids.
Yeah, right. I think Scott's giving me the whistle. So I'm going to, and if anybody wants to know where to get this food, I think most of the people here know that. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Gary, thank you very much. I'm gonna skip lunch.
Do I stop this?
Sure. Alrighty, let's see. I just took what I was supposed to say and I put it back here. Alrighty. Again, thank you very much. Our next speaker is in 2 weeks and brings us Dr. James Lloyd, a senior research scientist and professor in the College of Nanotechnology Science and Engineering, Department of Nanoscale Science and Engineering, who just happened to pop himself into a replica of a 1911 Wright Brothers Pusher EX biplane and recreated the first US East to West Coast flight. He'll be here to share the incredible story of that magnificent man and of flying machine. That's in 2 weeks. Thank you all for coming. I would like to ask the board members to stay a little bit later. We want to talk a little bit about our chairs.
These?
No,
Better ones.
in fact, we're thinking about sending them all to your farm and letting your sheep.
Well, one of the things we've thought about was having, inviting, like a string quartet to play music in our barn. Well, and having people come and listen to the music and watch the sheep appreciate the music. So, so maybe we can make a deal.
Tremendous.
And maybe